Hello and welcome back to Autumn's Notes app, where we explore all things written, filmed, and otherwise recorded for our collective research and yapping purposes. My name is Autumn, and today I want to talk about this book, Call It What You Want by Alissa DeRogatis, and a little bit about what we can learn from the way these characters are written, the way their story unfolds, and maybe why the messaging, despite its intentions, is not the best. I don't have a super thorough script for this video. I want it to be a little more conversational. I have my notes written down on a Google Doc, so if I'm looking off to the side, I'm just referencing those. But I just have some bullet point notes and some of my thoughts kind of out in a stream of consciousness. But this is going to be more of a chatty video because I do think I have a bit to say on this subject. First of all, I do want you to know that I am a romance girly. I mean, you just see all the books here. Trust me, I love the romance genre, so this is not a video to be hating on romance as a whole. I just want to say that up front because this is a genre that I enjoy. So if you have any concerns about you thought I might be, hating on this as a romance, that's not what it is. I love romance books. I also want to give a spoiler warning for pretty much the whole contents of this book and the way that the plot plays out. I didn't know this until after, but I gather that this did gain a good bit of traction on TikTok, so there's a chance that you've heard of it before. And so if you think the premise sounds interesting to you and you still want to give it a shot, then that's completely fine. And maybe skip this video and come back after you finish it, and we can, have a conversation once you've formed your own thoughts. But if you want to be more informed going into this about whether it's a reading experience you would enjoy, then maybe stay and see for yourself. The last thing I want to say is that this is DeRogatis' debut novel, and because of that, I think we should give some leeway. It's a really big thing for an author to publish a debut novel. It's very impressive, and I don't want to make it sound like I think she's just a bad writer. I don't think she's a bad writer, and given that this is her debut, there is plenty of room for her to grow in her craft, and I would be open to reading more of her writing in the future, especially, if she takes feedback into consideration moving forward. I think that's absolutely a possibility. When I talk about my thoughts on a book, it's never to try and come after the author. And so I just want us to keep that in mind as we go into our conversation today, that this is a debut and this should not be treated as the end all be all of the author's career. I have every belief that she could go on to write books that I would really enjoy. And with that said, let's, I guess, start with the premise of the book. Throughout the novel, we follow our female main character, Sloane, and our male love interest, Ethan, both communications majors in their final year of college. And the two of them meet on the college shuttle on the first day of senior year of college. And they find out they live in the same apartment building. He's actually her upstairs neighbor. And on this shuttle ride to campus, their connection is instantaneous. They both feel it, how it's really easy to talk to each other and open up about things. Pretty quickly, they start interacting at parties because he is in, I believe he's in Pi Kappa Alpha, I want to say. I'm not well versed in fraternities, but it's shorthand Pike. Sloane and her two roommates, who are her very good friends, they were in a sorority up until their sophomore year. So they kind of share they share some social circles, and pretty soon they're pretty enmeshed because Sloane's best friend Lauren starts dating Ethan's best friend Graham. So as they're kind of getting closer, Sloane and Ethan do become at least physically involved over fall break or winter break, excuse me. The question kind of becomes, what is this? What are we doing? And on Ethan's end, he's kind of avoiding answering those questions for reasons that Sloane doesn't know until later. He really struggles with commitment issues and feeling like he can't give her a relationship, even though that is what she wants. He can't quite give that to her. And so unfolds a 2 year, maybe a little bit more than that long situationship, so to speak, which follows them from their small college town to the streets of New York City. It's kind of like an ongoing push and pull between them. The whole point is that he's not, her ex boyfriend, he's essentially her ex almost, which it can be tricky. I think it's taken a lot more seriously if you say, like, oh, I'm having a hard time getting over my ex boyfriend. It can be harder to explain to people, like, oh, I'm having a hard time getting over this person. We never actually were in a relationship, and I'm not really sure what I was to him, but, it can get a little tricky. So I guess I'm jumping ahead a little into things that I liked, but I like the exploration of that because that's not the direction that a lot of romance books take. And maybe they're in that phase for a while where one person can't fully commit to the other, but then they get there. Whereas with this book, I guess maybe it wouldn't be labeled solely a romance. I do think there are coming of age elements in that as well, and contemporary. This was published in 2024, by the way. I do want to say that before I talk about some of the other things I'm going to mention. So I do think it's a valid perspective to bring to the table to look at how meaningful and impactful a connection with someone can be, even if it was never officially labeled a relationship. I think that's a very powerful thing to explore, and I think it would be relatable to a lot of people. I think the pacing was overall decent in the novel. It follows them through their senior year of college and then a couple years into adult working life in New York City. And for the most part, the flow of time felt pretty reasonable. I was never sitting during my reading experience thinking to myself, oh, this feels rushed, or oh, this is really dragging out, at least not in terms of, the progression from one event to the next. Another thing I appreciated is that the side characters were pretty well integrated into the story, even when they weren't directly contributing to the progression of the romance or the interactions between Ethan and Sloane. It does have the benefit that Sloane and her best friend Lauren, they become roommates in New York City too, so she was inherently around. But I think overall it still did a good job of incorporating their friends, whether it was talking on the phone or thinking about them or seeing their posts on Instagram, something like that. I did feel like Sloane and Ethan each had a network of social relationships. I didn't feel like the novel narrowed in too much on just their interactions with each other. And I think that's a huge plus. Now, with all of that said, we're going to get into some of my issues with this novel, or otherwise just things that I wanted to point out. And in order to do that, I'll have to kind of give you Ethan's backstory of why it is he feels like he can't commit himself to a relationship with Sloane. And for that, I do want to give a trigger warning for alcoholism and alcoholism related accidents, specifically vehicular accidents. There is death involved. So if you feel like that's something you can't hear about, you can skip forward. The summary of it is he feels like he was abandoned by his parents, essentially. So if you don't want to hear, the specifics of it, you can skip forward to the next section. I'll have it timestamped. For those of you still here, Ethan's father owned a bar, and a lot of the time he would be drinking. It seems like on the job and after work as well. And one night he was driving his car. Ethan's mom was in the passenger seat. She had been drinking as well because there had been a party hosted at the bar. And driving drunk, they hit someone who was riding a bike and they killed that person. And both of them got arrested. Of course, Ethan's father, who was driving, got more time. He got 10 years, while his mother was released after about one, I believe. But Ethan's trauma centers around the fact that after his mother was released from prison, she didn't come back for him as she had promised. So he had been staying with his best friend Graham's family. Their parents very kindly took him in, and the agreement was that once his mom was released, she would come back for him and they would, try to pick up the pieces pretty much. But instead of doing that, when his mom got out of prison, she decided to completely wipe the slate clean, start a new life. She moved states and is now married to someone else with a child. So Ethan feels like he's not a worthy receiver of love, or that, based on his life experiences, long term lasting love is not something he could have. And he also fears hurting a potential partner by leaving her the way that his mother left their family. So his thinking is essentially, well, if I get into a relationship with Sloane and we call it that, well, what if one day I leave her and end up hurting her? So that's kind of his backstory and where he's coming from, and where his struggle to commit kind of stems from. I expected the drinking in this novel to be addressed quite differently. Obviously, the first part of it takes place while they're at college. They're involved in like the frat sorority party scene, and there's a lot of drinking. Um, I do feel like a lot of the times the descriptions were excessive, but it wasn't necessarily unexpected. But then when Sloane and Lauren move to New York City, and when Ethan eventually does too, their social scene and their time together is still predominantly centered around alcohol, or experiences slash locations where they will consume alcohol. So they might be on a double date with a friend at a restaurant and they have to mention that they order a bunch of alcohol. Or anytime Ethan and Sloane hang out at one of their places, even if they're, watching something on Netflix, it's mentioned how much alcohol they're having. And at first, I thought this was going somewhere because there would be specific mentions of how much Sloane was drinking. So even in college, she would be narrating a night out, and then it would end with her saying, I drank too much and we had to Uber back to our place. Or, they would get somewhere and she'd be like, oh, I didn't realize I was so tipsy already. Like maybe I had too much at the pregame. So I was like, okay, interesting. I was taking note of that. Then in the New York City chapters, that continued. So she would mention how she drank too much on a night out and had to Uber back. Or Ethan would be like, oh, I noticed that Sloane has drank an entire, like, or half a bottle of wine by herself. Or he'd be like, oh, anytime she has more than two or three glasses of wine is when she starts up with these hypotheticals like, oh, what are we? What are we doing? Etc. So it wasn't just her subjectively being like, oh, I drank too much. It was Ethan as well in his narration, specifically noting how much she was drinking. And so I was thinking to myself, okay, maybe the author is setting up for a conversation here, because alcohol can be a coping mechanism, and an unhealthy one, even if it's something that you used to just enjoy in a recreational capacity. A lot of college experiences are centered around alcohol, especially if you're involved in frat sorority life. So the transition to Sloane herself might not seem so bad because it's what she's accustomed to, but even from outside, it seemed like Ethan was observing that she was drinking alcohol, especially when stressed, like stressed about work, stressed about their relationship. And I thought maybe it would be a conversation of like, hey, like, I'm concerned about you. This is seeming like perhaps an excessive, unhealthy habit. Things ended up going a bit of a different way, though. I want to read you a quote from one of Ethan's chapters pretty late into the book from page 258 to 259. So he says, I walk into her apartment and notice that there's a half empty bottle of wine on the counter. Part of me was expecting that. She always drinks when she's nervous. Usually I don't mind it, but for some reason today it really bothers me. It makes me wonder if alcohol is a coping mechanism for her. I can't build a life with someone who turns to alcohol when things get tough. Alcohol is the sole reason my life ended up the way it did, and I really don't want to sign up for a rerun. End quote. My problem with this is not that he's like reluctant or, hesitant to be around that kind of behavior. I think that's completely understandable. The problem is that this is solely about him, and he isn't approaching it with even consideration that it's like, oh, this is also not good for her. Maybe that's something that we need to talk about. It's just like, I'm annoyed that she drinks too much alcohol because it reminds me of what happened with my parents, and I can't be around that. I'm not trying to invalidate that at all, because I do think it can be important and even necessary for people who have experiences like that, to sit down with a partner and say, hey, because of this very, either traumatic, impactful event in my life, this is a hard line for me. Like, I know people feel that way about smoking, for example, if they have a loved one who was impacted by lung cancer or even passed from it, then that can be a hard line for them with partners. Like, hey, I don't tolerate smoking of any kind or tobacco of any kind. So I think that's a completely valid conversation, because that is, at that point, a personal boundary. It's like, I know how harmful this behavior can be, what it can lead to. Therefore, I cannot subject myself to a partnership with someone who is willingly exhibiting that behavior, knowing what that means to me. I think that's a completely valid conversation. The problem is, he doesn't have that conversation with her. In fact, that excerpt I read you is like 4 chapters before the end of the book, and he never brings it up. Not even in the context of like, I don't like that you do this, and certainly not in the context of, I'm a little concerned that I've noticed these things. It's just something that he thinks to himself, and it's all about him. And I am a little disappointed that the messaging didn't go anywhere else with that, because I think it could have been a meaningful conversation, and it could have allowed Sloane to perhaps reflect on some of her behavior that she wasn't even registering as potentially harmful. And instead, Ethan's inner monologue kind of made it like, well, alcohol is the singular thing that has ever made things go wrong in my life. And so it's annoying that Sloane is drinking alcohol a lot, even though I'm not going to bring this up to her that I feel that way. And also, I'm apparently not concerned for how it's impacting her, only how it's impacting me. Does that make sense? Like, I hope this wasn't just a long ramble. I hope you like understand what I'm trying to say here. Another factor I want to bring up is the completely unbelievable concept of Sloane's employment after graduation. Not the prospect that she could be employed, but specifically what job she gets. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, Sloane is a communications major, and in the fall of her senior year, she's also taking a creative writing course. Writing is something she says she's enjoyed and been passionate about, particularly through her journal. but she does mention that she's not getting very good grades in her creative writing class. Her professor specifically tells her that she is kind of lacking sensory details in her writing. And that is, in fact, never resolved because in the narrative, the timeline just goes from, oh, I just finished my midterms to, oh, it's fall break now to, oh, it's Thanksgiving now to, oh, it's winter break and the semester is over. But there's no mention of how things wrapped up academically within that. So last we heard, Sloane was not doing very well in the only writing class that she was taking. And then in spring semester of her senior year, she applied to like three jobs in New York City. At first, three jobs at first. And mind you, she is coming from a university in North Carolina. So she applies to jobs in New York City, editorial jobs, and happens to land an editorial assistant position at a pretty well known online magazine called The Gist. Now, I don't have paid professional experience in the publishing and journalism industry, so, correct me if I'm wrong, but Sloane seems grossly underqualified for such a position. There is no mention of any internships or, field experience, any efforts made to publish any of the writing she's done. There's not even a mention of her having like a job, a part-time job of any kind throughout college. And like I said, last we heard, her writing was not very good. So this was interesting to me to begin with, especially because I think there would be a route to take here of like maybe she really pours her passion into a piece for her creative writing class that impresses her professor, and then that's what she uses to submit as a sample in her job applications. That I could maybe buy into a little bit more if it was like a stunning piece of writing. But as it is, there's no justification for why she would be able to land such a job. It felt very fanciful and definitely one of those cases of like an author makes their main character a writer because they themselves are a writer. It's what they know. But the logic within the world doesn't necessarily operate well, especially for the heights that the character reaches. And maybe I could have overlooked this despite the lack of information on salary and how her and her best friend Lauren are somehow affording a two-bedroom, third floor walk up in Manhattan on an editorial assistant and teaching role salary. Questionable at best, but maybe I could have let it go if it were not for the fact that the author included one of Sloane's writing pieces in the book. So, in universe, after Ethan ends things between them for the second time, mind you, Sloane decides to really pour her heartbreak and kind of reflection, rumination into pitches for the online magazine that she works for. And she ends up publishing a viral piece called An Open Letter to the Guy Who Didn't Want to Date Me. So essentially, she's addressing Ethan, but it ends up being relatable to a lot of women who have maybe experienced impactful relationships with people that they didn't actually date. Like I said, this goes viral, gets like millions of views. Her boss is so impressed that she promotes her to staff writer. Pretty soon after that, she gets a raise. So, this is supposed to be her thing that catapulted her to success and that really showed what her writing chops are. And then at the end of one of the chapters, the blog post in question was included. And I got excited because I was like, okay, this is a chance to actually see her writing voice because we hadn't gotten that prior to this. And I thought, it was going to be clever, witty, like raw and emotional. And I thought, all right, this could actually be a great thing to include. Unfortunately, after I read this, I could not help but feel that maybe there wasn't adequate research done into what a women focused online magazine sounds like, what its blog posts might sound like. I don't want to read you the whole thing, but I'm going to read you the first couple paragraphs because I think they're the most egregious ones, and then we'll talk about why I think this doesn't really support Sloane as a character and a writer. Dear X something, I'm writing you this letter in hopes that it'll give me the closure that you were never able to. September 1st is this week, which means it'll be the third month without you. 3 months without you in my bed, in my inbox, and in my heart as someone who didn't break it. It's weird seeing the seasons start to change. It's like time is moving so quickly yet so slowly. I think back to that night in June, the night you ended things. Sometimes I feel like it was a year ago. Sometimes I feel like it was yesterday. The days are easy, but the nights are hard. That's when I miss you the most. What I don't miss, though, is the hurting. I mean, I do still hurt, but not in the same way I did when we were together. The constant wondering, am I not enough for him? Why am I not good enough? Why doesn't he love me the way I love him? Will he ever love me? Even just typing out these questions hurts my heart so badly. So maybe on your own, you can kind of see some of what I'm talking about, but if not, that's okay. I do want to point out specific things. My main critique of this piece is that it's quite repetitive and at the same time not terribly personal and specific. So there are these two sentences. It's like time is moving so quickly yet so slowly. And then a sentence later, sometimes I feel like it was a year ago. Sometimes I feel like it was yesterday. So that's the same concept being conveyed of like time has moved strangely since you left. And even though it's phrased differently, it is at the end of the day the same feeling being communicated. And so I felt that at least one of those sentences was not necessary. The other one I noticed was when Sloane was listing out some of the questions she'd be wondering to herself during the relationship. And the first two that she says are, am I not enough for him? Why am I not good enough? And I know those aren't the exact same thing. Like, in theory, the first one leads into the other, but it would be far more concise to say something like, just, am I not good enough for him? Or, why am I not enough for him? Or something to that effect. They are too close to the same thing to be included back to back like that, and it was just a little, I hate saying this, it felt kind of elementary. Like I do not believe that writing of this level would be posted on a well-known online magazine, and not only that, but that it would go viral. And the other thing is that this sounds like it could be written by anyone and not just Sloane. Like nothing about this is specific to her experience. And I think that's what really gave me the sense of like, there's no way she got this job. Like, there's no way this is what went viral because there's no mention of her specific, like, emotional experience other than just saying that, oh, I'm still hurting, but not in the same way I did when we were together. And it's like, okay, how are you hurting now? Then explain that, maybe you see specific things that remind you of him, and even though it makes you relive all of the memories, you realize that it wasn't right in the end. Or saying that, I don't know, I just, maybe it's just me, you can let me know, but I think specific details here would have lent so much towards being more impactful. This does sound like something that would be written in a journal, like, oh, I don't miss hurting, like wondering if he loves me, wondering if I'm enough for him. Or, like, that's a conversation you would have with your best friend, maybe. I don't think this is the quality of writing that would be published and that would go viral. The last sub point I want to make before I get to my main thing is that maybe this is a hot take, but I can't root for any romance that involves one or more person cheating on their significant other with their love interest. Like, when that happens, I'm instantly not rooting for you anymore. I think the logic is usually supposed to be like, well, they're like soulmates. They're meant to be together. They couldn't help that they were with other people at first, but like they're right for each other. So it's actually okay that cheating is how they got together. And it's like, no, I don't think so. In my opinion, cheating is one of the least excusable, most like morally deplorable things you can do to a partner. So when Sloane, who was in a relationship with a guy for several months at this point, invited Ethan up to her apartment, I was like, oh, not a good move. What's going on here? And yeah, then they slept together. And it was an entire scene of like them getting up to the apartment, talking a little, yada yada, things happen. And in that whole time, her boyfriend's existence doesn't cross her mind once. She only remembers that he exists after Ethan leaves. And then she's like, oh shoot, my boyfriend. And it's like, yeah, your boyfriend. Uh-huh. You just cheated on him. Okay. And then if I gave you a guess, how long do you think it took her to tell her boyfriend that she cheated on him? You're like, a few days, a week, 2 weeks, a month. She doesn't tell her boyfriend for a month, and they are still dating during that time. And then she tells him, and he's upset, obviously. Like, he knew she had a history with this guy, and he was like, I was afraid this was gonna happen. And she was like, I think she literally says, I'm gonna try to find the part in the book. Okay, I found it. She tells him, you just don't understand. And he's like understandably angry, like, what is it that I don't understand? And she's like, it's not like that. I loved you, I really did, but now that he's around, it's just different. I can't be in a relationship with all of these unresolved feelings. It's not fair to either of us. Which is true. She should, in fact, not be dating this guy. And she also should not have cheated on him. She should have just broken up with him when she realized that she had unresolved feelings for her ex situationship. Both of those things can be true at once. And if that weren't bad enough, she is completely hypocritical about this because earlier in the story, when they were still in college, she and Ethan had been hooking up for a couple months at this point, and they were gathered with some friends playing Never Have I Ever. And one of their friends says, Never have I ever cheated on someone. And Ethan puts a finger down, meaning that he has cheated on someone before. And Sloane is so upset by this. She's like, I don't like that I know you've cheated on someone before, because what if you did that to me? Meanwhile, they have not defined exclusivity or defined anything about their relationship. And she's so upset by this. She gets out of the hot tub that they were all in and goes to the bathroom, and when he follows her, and that's when she tells him like, oh, I'm upset about this. He even tells her it was back in high school. He was like 15. Not that that excuses it, but some time has passed. She's still so upset that she's like, I'm just like going to bed to be by myself, tell everyone else that I'm not feeling well. So mind you, she's so upset by hearing this, that he has cheated on someone. And then she does exactly that to her boyfriend with Ethan. Like, girl, bye. I was really trying to see her side. Like, I wanted to be rooting for her, but she just lost me at that point. There's no situation in which I feel like this would have been acceptable, especially not between the two main characters that I'm in theory meant to be rooting for. But anyway, now that you have all that context, this brings me to my main point. which is even if there are good intentions behind the messaging, there is still a complete lack of accountability from, you could argue, both of these characters, but mostly from Ethan. And I think that actually ends up imparting a more harmful message on the viewer. A lot of this book was spent with Ethan kind of, he doesn't ever tell Sloane what happened with his parents, by the way. She hears that from his best friend, Graham. But, he spends the whole book creating these ties of like, why am I like this? But it's just who I am. Like, why can't I just be who she deserves? Why can't I give her a relationship? But he spends a lot of the book just saying, like, this is just who I am. And he doesn't explicitly say, I can't change or I don't want to change. But that is kind of how it feels. Like, by the end of the book, he is 23 years old, and it's like, therapy therapy is an option, self-reflection, anything of that sort. Instead, here is his inner monologue on page 262, like 15 pages before the end of the book. This is the imparting perspective that we get from him. This is his final word on his behavior and his being. He says, "What's wrong with me? Why am I so fucked up? I mean, I know why I'm fucked up. My parents did this to me. Why can't I let someone love me when it's all I've wanted my entire life? All I've wanted was to feel loved, and as soon as someone tries, I push them away. I really thought if I let Sloane love me, eventually I'd get there too. Instead, this is where we are. 3 breakups, 2 years, and one really broken heart." Give me a break, my guy. Oh my god. He just feels sorry for himself and is like, to the very end, blaming his parents for everything. And don't get me wrong, he experienced something very traumatic that I think would affect anyone's view of, relationships, especially romantic relationships. But to be 23 years old and refuse to see that you need to take responsibility for your actions is bonkers to me. That's part of an argument you can make. Like, here's where I'm coming from. This is my thought process. These are the factors that have affected the way that I see the world. But you cannot pin your actions on that. Your history and the things you've experienced can be an explanation for why certain behaviors have become normalized to you, but they cannot be a justification. I really spent most of this book hoping we would get to a point of Ethan self reflecting. This does sound like the start of self awareness, right? He says, all I've wanted was to feel loved, and as soon as someone tries, I push them away. And it's like, okay, so you see what you're doing, you understand the cause and effect there. Throughout the whole novel, I was hoping he'd come to the realization of, I need to like take charge of this. I need to get it together. If not for Sloane, maybe we just weren't meant to work out, but for the people that I interact with in the future, I need to look at my behavior. And even if you don't want to seek professional help, even though I think you should, maybe I need to work on myself and unlearn these unhealthy patterns. And instead, to the very end, accountability, no. Blame, no. Responsibility, integrity, like awareness, there's just none of it. That ends up being harmful messaging for the end of the book, because I think there are people reading this book that are either in Sloane's position or even in Ethan's position. Someone who is struggling to get over someone that they didn't date, but that it felt like they could if they could just, be the person that they needed. That population exists. And then you have another population of people who have experienced very difficult life events and as a result have maybe gotten into a cycle of toxic, dysfunctional relationships. And I think both groups of people reading this book could maybe acknowledge and look inward and think, oh, I actually relate to a lot of what's happening here. And I think what needed to happen is for the narrative to convey that that's not a good thing. But ultimately, I don't think it does. The main message ends up being more so that, well, her and Ethan just weren't right for each other. They weren't the right people to make it work together. And even though they kind of knew that going in, they still tried their best and ended up hurting each other in the end. But despite that, it was still love. Like they were still each other's first loves, even if they weren't meant to be together. That would be a fine message if she wasn't a cheater and he wasn't completely refusing to take accountability for his actions. Like I said, I do think people reading this could relate to either one of them or both of them, but even if it was going to end with Ethan not taking accountability for his own control of his life and his actions, the narrative should have condemned that and should have made it clear that he was in the wrong for not accepting responsibility for his actions. But that doesn't happen. The novel ends with them making eye contact at their friend's wedding, and Sloane just thinks to herself, I still loved him through all of that, and even though there was a lot of hurt, it was still love. And that's valid. She's allowed to feel that way. But I also think there should be some acknowledgement that he had no right to treat her the way he did and blame it on his trauma. That's a potentially dangerous message to be sending because the narrative in general doesn't condemn Ethan for a lot of what he's doing. And I can't help but be concerned that people either in his shoes who could use the self reflection are not really going to get it because he's not painted as the bad guy necessarily. It's just like, oh, they weren't right for each other. And people in Sloane's situation who are like hung up on someone that maybe has treated them not the best or been unable to commit to them because of their warped view of relationships, they might read this and end up thinking, well, that's just how he is because of XYZ, and we were just never going to work because he couldn't be vulnerable with me because of XYZ. I think it just frees both parties of responsibility where you can certainly acknowledge that maybe a relationship wasn't going to work no matter what, and you just weren't the right people to build a long term lasting foundation with each other. I also think you can acknowledge that one or more people in the situation failed to learn from a pattern of behavior. They failed to put in effort to change a pattern of behavior, to self reflect, to earnestly communicate. Sloane and Ethan do not communicate well at all. It's not as if they can look back on this and say, like, we gave it our best shot. They most certainly didn't. And that's because neither of them were willing to make the effort to be open with each other. I just want you to know, if you're listening to this, if someone treats you the way that Ethan treats Sloane, where you never really know where you stand with them, if they're going to truly commit to you, if you can even see a future, if you have to wonder about like if they really care about you or if they care about you as much as you care about them, just take a step back and really ask yourself, is this what you want to be doing for an indefinite amount of time? It is okay to love someone and to also know that being in a relationship or just being romantically entangled, involved, however you want to put it, is not the best thing for either of you. And if you are watching this and you relate more to Ethan's position, where you've experienced some really difficult things in life and that has made it hard to form healthy, stable relationships, then I would say also take a step back. You don't have to be in a relationship right now, especially if you can acknowledge that you struggle to form healthy habits within the context of a partnership. There's nothing wrong with taking a break from dating, especially if you acknowledge that trying to do so might end up with you hurting the other person before you've worked through a lot of those internal things. This has been a pretty rambly video, but I hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you've read this book, did you have some of the same issues that I did? Or are you kind of looking back on it differently now that I've brought certain things up? Maybe you completely disagree with me and you absolutely loved it. I would love to hear your perspective as well. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you want more content like this, then make sure to subscribe. And if you feel like you got something out of this video or that you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like. That's all for today. I'll see you next time I open my notes app. Bye!